I think to a degree, most of us do understand what belongs to culture, to this broad category of things. But since such topic as cultural appropriation is still existing in society and a lot of people are talking about it, I decided to make a video in this category, how to debate about culture. And today we will talk briefly about what is culture, what defines culture more or less, or rather less actually, and what kinds of culture there is, as well as a little bit about cultural appropriation. Let's go! But before we begin, I have to tell you that this is Yury Experience, and here I share my various experiences about different topics. I currently upload one piece of content per week, and if you enjoy this piece of content, like, subscribe, do whatever is possible on your platform. Let's go! Obviously, we start with the definitions. Culture. What is culture? With my own words, culture is something like a list of various ideas, customs, maybe behavioral types that exist in some specific group in the society. But basically, pretty much everything can belong to culture, even how we do some biological stuff. There is one of the definitions of culture that says everything that humans do, except for biological stuff, is culture. But let's think about that for a second. Biological stuff, for example, eating, we need to consume food. But how we grow food is a part of culture. How we consume food is a part of culture. How people sit down for dinner, do they do it with the whole family? Do they say a prayer, as for example Catholic families do? Is there some specific strange tradition that exists specifically in this family? Every time they eat, I don't know, jello. They eat jello and then they do that. That's every time they do it. This tradition will technically be also part of culture. Another stuff that is considered pretty biological is reproduction, and how people have sex is also different, sometimes depending on the culture. Some cultures are more conservative, other cultures are more open to various things like kinks or some changes, something that goes a couple of steps away from this conservative or traditionalist point of view. But obviously, a lot of occasions when we are talking about culture, we are not talking about biological stuff, we are talking about music, we are talking about art, we are talking about architecture, something that defines some group of people or maybe the whole society for some period of time. There are a lot of scales in culture. We go from the huge scale, from societies, from actually regions in the world, to very small scales. And one of the examples that I saw on one page, on one site, was that the world, like a lot of countries in the world, not all of them, can be kinda divided in one of the following culture groups. For example, Western culture. These are the countries that are in Europe or were heavily influenced by Europe and are considered very similar culturally and in terms of development to Europe. Then we have Asian cultures, and actually what people mean when they say Asian, they mean Southeast Asian plus India, and there we have countries from there that were connected to each other historically and philosophically and religiously. Latin American countries, and there is not even one definition for what countries belong to Latin America, but basically the countries that were colonized by Spain, by Portugal, and again they have a lot of influence from Portugal and Spain, but also from a lot of African countries, because there were a lot of slaves living in Latin American countries. And obviously African culture, which is the oldest in the world, but also very broadly defined, because there are a hell lot of tribes and different groups of people and also countries in Africa. And each small part of Africa has its own culture. Obviously there are a lot of influences of other places. For example, Northern African culture is connected to Middle Eastern culture, which is, by the way, also one independent big culture. Middle Eastern culture is like basically Arab countries, and there was a lot of influence of Ottoman Empire during the time of Ottoman Empire, and also basically of Islam, because it is the major religion there. Obviously these cultures are very broad and they don't explain culture completely for all the countries, but they do explain some of the connections, some of the relationships between countries and influences of countries on one another, because on the end of the day, a lot of culture that we have right now is based on history, how political decisions were done in the past, what wars we had, what countries were where, because at the moment we don't have the same location for all of the countries. For example, as I mentioned already, Ottoman Empire doesn't exist anymore, and in place of Ottoman Empire we have a couple of other countries. Or another example, China and Japan were like big colonizators during their time, but they are not anymore. They still have their surface area, but they're not as huge as they were prior to now. For example, Korea, if I'm not mistaken, was for a long time under China. Now it is not the case anymore. And then we go from this huge scale to smaller scale, like individual countries and their connections between each other. And then we go to a smaller scale, maybe some regions in each country, like for example, African countries have a lot of people or a lot of groups of people that are regionally, culturally full or rich, but Europe is, for example, also not very different, because there are a lot of countries which have like specific, the pretty defined different regions, each of which has independent culture, but they are together, like geographically they are a part of one country, but not culturally, only geographically. Then we go to a smaller scale, for example cities. An example, here in Germany there's a huge soccer culture, and here it is like literally almost like small wars or soccer wars, depending on what city you belong to. You also belong to the soccer team, or you need to celebrate the soccer team from there. And then we go even smaller, like parts of the cities, parts of the towns. A great example there is Chinatown, which exists, like Chinatown exists in the various cities in USA, in other countries too. And that is like small city inside of the city that has its own culture. It depends obviously on the culture of the city, but also its own like spice in it. And then we go even smaller and we go to families and even to individuals, but like on individual level it is a big question whether it is like individual behavior or it is literally culture. But I also think that it depends on how much influence has this individual on other people, because technically that person can spread culture, maybe not create it, but spread it. Speaking of spreading the culture, culture changes all the time. Now it is even more okay, kinda, to change culture, to change traditions than it was prior to now. And it also happens way faster. How many trends we have that appear and disappear inside of 1 year, and that is also part of the culture. Technological trends, maybe some design or clothing trends. They appear, they disappear, and that is all part of our history, part of our development, and also part of our culture. Something that was unacceptable 10 years ago is completely acceptable now, and maybe even will be expected 10 years from now. Let me provide you a couple of examples that lead to change in culture, and here we have various political and historical decisions, for example wars or some declarations of freedom, or maybe changes in laws. Wars, for example, lead to hunger, and if we have hunger we have less resources, and how people interact with each other will change, because they need to deal in some way with this little amount of resources. And it is obviously only one of the examples what war leads to. Example of freedom, there was a fall of the wall in Berlin in 1998 or 1990, somewhere there was Berlin Wall, and it wasn't no more after 1998? I'm not sure. But the point is, after that point, Germany wasn't the same. After that point, two parts of Germany united itself, and afterwards the mixed culture started to appear. And obviously some people will say that still there you feel some difference between West Germany and East Germany, how they were from that time, but it changed a lot since then. A lot of changes happened. Some stuff that wasn't allowed in East Germany is allowed now, because that there was authoritarian regime prior to the fall of the wall. Afterwards it was kind of democracy. And laws, great example, allowance of LGBTQ marriage, various types of it, and like 10 years ago, in a lot of countries it wasn't possible. Now it is possible in a lot of countries, which makes it more normal, which makes it less strange in everyday life to see homosexual people who are married, which leads to change of our understanding or our seeing, change to how we see life or how we see relationships. We see that as normal. That leads to change in our comprehension of traditions, and it changed culture. Another example, pop culture. There are always some people who influence culture of the majority. Some like popularity vote was done, and these people were chosen to make some decisions that other people find important or interesting and repeat them basically after these selected people. During some time in our history, these were kings, queens, aristocrats, or however you call it. Now it's celebrities like stars, TV stars, music stars. Some of them only change music and how we view music and what we do with music, and others change our comprehension even of style. For example, Beatles influence not only music, they also influence how people clothe themselves. They also influenced some ideas in people. And they are not the only ones. Depending on what music you look up to, that music can influence how you view the world if that music is written in some specific way. And if the music changes the opinion of enough people, then cultural change appears. If a lot of people simultaneously start thinking differently, then basically a big part of society starts thinking differently, then maybe it will even spread to the whole society. Is it good or bad? Different topic, but it can and may and does happen. Obviously, if we are talking about culture, we also need to touch at least the topic of cultural appropriation, since it is something that is loud topic and it happens on news like all the time, or at least it was very present some time ago, but I still think that it is important now. First definition, cultural appropriation, in my own words, is taking something unacknowledged from another culture and taking it to your culture and saying it belongs there, as I said already, without acknowledging the fact that it actually comes from the other culture. It is a difficult topic, and the first and major reason for why it is difficult is because a lot of major cultures in various countries stole a lot of ideas and cultural traditions, physical stuff that some cultures created. Major cultures stole that for themselves and said it is now ours, and we use it and we do with it whatever we want. That's why, although the definition is pretty broad, a lot of people don't hesitate to use the word, this phrase, cultural appropriation, in a lot of occasions when they see it due. When some people, for example, dress themselves as if they are from other culture. Or, for example, one person behaves themselves as if that person belongs to one culture, although that person doesn't do it because of various reasons. For example, that person wasn't born in that culture or didn't experience stuff that is relevant for that culture. Since it is on a lot of occasions difficult to define what is culture, it is obviously also difficult to define what is cultural appropriation. Which is why first I will say, if you clearly see it is something that doesn't lie in pop culture, only some specific group of people does it, and only them do it, then prior to repeating of doing what they do, educate yourself. Ask maybe people who belong to that culture, is it even okay for you to do it? Because it may be that people will try to hit you, try to hurt you because you try to imitate another culture. A little bit down to earth example of that, you probably know shoes Adidas Air Max. I'm not sure whether you know, but maybe you know, and there's like specific type of shoe, it looks in a specific type of way. And in Russia, in the city where I lived, during some specific time, only hooligans, like soccer hooligans, were wearing these shoes. And if they saw you wearing these shoes, you could get in trouble. And does it make sense? No. But that is part of their culture, it belongs to their culture, and you could be hurt if you are trying to do as if you belong to their culture. Is it humane or morally acceptable? No. But it is safe. It is safer. Just saying you the truth. And another point in the same direction, please don't monetize on some specific culture without asking the people if they want you to monetize on them, and maybe even sharing the profits, because that would be the morally acceptable way or thing to do. And then we go away from something that clearly belongs to one culture. We go away from there, and starting from there, it kind of makes less sense to try to guard the culture. Because basically, when we are going away from something that is clearly accepted as something that belongs to one specific culture, we go in basically in direction of pop culture, and the more pop something is, the highest probability that people will do it independent of what you are thinking about. There was a huge topic of dreads and whether people that don't have African heritage or heritage of one of the African countries, whether these people are allowed to wear dreads. And people in Europe, like a lot of people, or in Russia, they haven't heard about this debate in the USA, and they didn't care. Shall they care? I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to care in this case, because it is something that can be done by pretty much everything. I'm talking about dreads. Like, yes, it is not healthy for every person's scalp, every person's hair, but pretty much everybody technically can do it if they do it right. And I am not very knowledgeable on dreads, but my point is, as soon as something goes away from something that is clearly belonging to only to one culture and comes to the world of pop culture, I think it is complicated to try to guard it, and I also don't think that it makes sense. Obviously, it is a good thing to do, to ask people of the culture what do they think about stuff that you are doing. It never hurts, but I also think that as soon as something is like right there to get, like basically if you can find something on Amazon, then probably yes, please educate yourself, but you can get it so easily. It is so affordable to get it because you can literally just order it per Amazon. Then it clearly belongs to one culture, but I don't think it is cultural appropriation anymore. If anything, we go in the direction of cultural appreciation, because normally a person wouldn't buy something just for fun. Like, there are people who have so much money who buy stuff just for fun without even thinking about that, but they normally don't buy something so specific, like something that clearly belongs to separate culture, but I want to have it because it is affordable and it is gettable and it is part of pop culture too. Normally only people who know something about the stuff buy stuff like that for themselves, which is why I think currently it is the safer bet. Always ask other people prior to do something, because I mean, do you want that struggle? Do you want the stress? If you clearly see that there is something that you haven't seen anywhere around you and during you growing up, then maybe it belongs to other culture, maybe ask first. But on the other hand, I do think that in current times we sometimes overdo with cultural appropriation, and people just trying to live their lives, and we find looking for the way to make their life more difficult, and I'm not a big fan of that. But that is my personal opinion. That's pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed this piece of content. If it is the case, please drop a like. You can also subscribe to the channel. You can also do what is possible on the platform of your choice. I'll see you next Monday.